Good morning. Welcome to this week's edition of History Comes Alive. Today and for the next 2 weeks, we're going to have fun exploring the fascinating history of Pennsylvania, the Keystone State. Now, I know some of you are relative newcomers to the state. Others of you may be longtime residents. I was born up in Lycoming County in 1950, and I spent, other than about 7 years when I was diverted to the Midwest, I've lived all my life in Pennsylvania. And I was so shocked. I was a young man when I moved with my wife to Ohio. And I remember we were in southwestern Ohio in Dayton, and I'm looking around asking myself, where are the hills? There are no hills in Ohio. I think the tallest point in Ohio is maybe 200 feet above the terrain. They actually have a ski slope there. I don't know, the skiing isn't very good. But then we moved from Ohio to Michigan. And in Michigan, I say, where are the forests I'm so accustomed to? And there's no forests in Michigan until you get north of Mackinac. And the other epiphany in Michigan was we went to visit the State Museum one day in the capital city, Lansing. And the State Museum at that time consisted of one floor in a converted house. And of course, I was familiar with what was then the William Penn Museum, now the State Museum in Harrisburg. I had visited it as a teenager, and obviously no comparison. And I know I've talked to Sue Albright, and I know you all have been to the State Museum in Harrisburg and a number of other locations that I'll be talking about during the next 3 weeks. But well worth a visit again when the pandemic lifts. So anyway, a lot of history in Pennsylvania, and a lot of what's beautiful about it is that, again, when the pandemic lifts, you can visit a lot of Pennsylvania history, and I'll be talking about not only Pennsylvania's past, but where in the present you can see Pennsylvania history either in a museum, a historic site, a memorial. So this program is not only history, but a bit of an anticipatory travelogue. So there you have the map of Pennsylvania. Very fortunately, it fits very nicely on a widescreen PowerPoint. In the early 1800s, Pennsylvania became known as the Keystone State informally because a keystone is the high central stone holding up an arch, the arch of the new republic. And you may not know this, but the keystone is actually not on any official state flag or state seal, but it does appear, they've adopted it fairly recently as a logo for all of the state departments in the state bureaucracy. They all have a keystone in some way, shape, or form. So in this series of programs, again, 3 sessions, today we'll be talking about the foundations of Pennsylvania, 17th, 18th century. Next week we'll look at the 19th century, the growth in both population and economic importance of Pennsylvania. And finally, in the last session, we'll look at the changing fortunes of the state and its people after 1900. So before we get into the history, though, let's take a look briefly at the land, because it does have an impact on history. 3 great river systems in Pennsylvania. Over here in the east is the Delaware, which flows down into Delaware Bay. The Susquehanna here, 2 branches, flows down into the Chesapeake Bay. And over here is the Ohio River system, 2 tributaries, the Allegheny and the Monongahela, into the Ohio, which flows all the way into the Mississippi. Very important, as I'll discuss in a few minutes. So the colony began here, obviously, along the lower reaches of the Delaware River, and in what is now the state of Delaware as well. Had easy access out into the Delaware Bay to the other colonies, and of course to Europe, so it was very important for commercial reasons. The interior here, first you come to this Piedmont area of flat or very, very gently rolling hills, never scraped by the glaciers. If you look at maps of glaciation in Pennsylvania, it extends really in this area. So this was never scraped clean during the Ice Age. And so the soil, very fertile, very deep, some of the best farmland in the colonies located here in southeastern Pennsylvania. But if you go west, the picture changes because you run into the Appalachian Mountains. And if you were an ambitious settler, you might find when you got off the boat in Philadelphia, as you go out into the hinterland, you may find much of the best land already taken. And so these mountains might funnel you down towards the southwest into what is now West Virginia, into North Carolina, and then you might do an end run over into Kentucky, as Daniel Boone did. I'll mention him in a minute. So this part of the state became relatively late to be settled. And in fact, up until really the early 20th century, it wasn't that easy to get from eastern Pennsylvania into the west because, again, of these intervening mountains. So that's a bit of geography lesson there, sort of to set the stage. Now let's take a look at the first people living in Pennsylvania. They were at Meadowcroft, a site southwest of Pittsburgh. It's on your handout, one of about 24 sites that I'll be talking about in some detail that you can visit today. Meadowcroft is the earliest human settlement in North America and occupied more or less continuously until the late 1700s. It's located overlooking a creek. It's in a sheltering outcrop. Now, the archaeological team has built a roof out over it to protect the digs, but just here off camera is the natural roof of this sort of open cave overlooking the stream down here. Archaeologists have dug down about 12 feet down into the layers of Meadowcroft, uncovered several million artifacts, tools, pottery fragments, nuts, seeds, even seashells from the Atlantic coast, which shows that the ancient Pennsylvanians who walked along this, the trail down by the creek spent periods of time here. They had some extensive involvement in long-distance trade. So a very interesting site. I should point out as a caveat, most of the artifacts taken here are not on site. They are at a college in Erie, whose name escapes me, but the college was involved in sponsoring the excavations. At the time of European settlement, there were about 15,000 Indians living in Pennsylvania. These are the major tribal groupings as they've been sketched out by anthropologists. Unlike the Indians of the Great Plains, Pennsylvania Indians were of what's called the Eastern Woodland culture. They lived in semi-permanent villages, relied mostly on food. They grew crops for food, supplemented by hunting and fishing. Extended families lived in these long houses. And this wooden palisade here, fence-like structure, tall fence, reminds us that it was not all peace in the pre-European era of settlement and even after the Europeans arrived. Shifting alliances, rivalries among the native tribes, periodic intertribal warfare was quite the norm. Now, with the coming of Europeans, as in South America, disease took a dreadful toll on the native population, especially smallpox. By 1800, the few remaining Indians in Pennsylvania had merged with tribes in New York or migrated west, and they only remain today in the form of place names. This portrait of a Lenape chief from 1735 gives us a bit of a window into this vanished culture in Pennsylvania. Now we're ready to move on to colonial Pennsylvania, our topic for most of today. And this shows a very neat, tidy settlement in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, along the Delaware River. A few buildings, farms, very productive, suggests the orderly, successful nature of European settlement in Pennsylvania. The first Europeans in Pennsylvania were French and Dutch trappers in the early 1600s, but in 1638, a Swedish expedition arrives, that's shown here, 40 men in 2 ships led by this gentleman, Peter Minuit. You may recall him as the former governor of New Netherlands, or New York, who bought Manhattan Island from the Lenape Indians. At that time, the Lenape Indians were not only in Pennsylvania, but their territory extended well to the east. The Swedes founded a colony, called it New Sweden, established a trading post in present-day Delaware, near Wilmington. And in 1643, they moved their administrative center to a site in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. This is the first permanent European settlement in what is now Pennsylvania. But New Sweden never had more than a few hundred residents, had little support from the mother country. Investors gradually lost interest. The colony of New Sweden was captured by the Dutch in 1655. And in 1674, England takes control of the entire region, all of New Netherlands. And 7 years later, in 1681, a huge swath of what had been New Netherlands became Pennsylvania. The founder of the colony was William Penn, who named it Penn's Woods, not after himself, but after his father, Sir William Penn, who was a former admiral in the Royal Navy. Sir William had loaned money to the King of England, Charles II, and to settle the debt, the king granted young William the proprietary right to run 45,000 square miles in the New World as his personal estate. At that time, William Penn became the largest private landowner in the world. His own finances were always a little bit shaky. He actually spent time in debtor's prison in England in 1708. After he suffered a series of strokes, he put his wife Hannah in charge, and she was Pennsylvania's first and only female governor for a time, and the descendants of the Penns continued to control the colony until the Revolution. This famous image on the right purports to show William Penn, but he did not personally sit for the portrait. That would contradict the humility that would be expected of a pious Quaker. So William Penn, as you probably know, was a Quaker. The faith is formerly known as the Society of Friends. Quakers emerged in the mid-17th century as dissenters from the established Church of England. Quakers felt they could experience the light of God within themselves without benefit of elaborate ceremonies or professional clergy. Their worship services were mostly silent, and are today, as you know. The Quakers still a very active faith in Pennsylvania. But they did have lay pastors to read the gospel during their meetings, including women. Female pastors, a shocking innovation for that time in history. Quakers dressed in simple garb. They behaved modestly in public. They shunned alcohol. They refused to swear oaths. And they were committed pacifists, which becomes a problem for Pennsylvania later. Penn envisioned his colony as a holy experiment where he and his fellow Quakers and other persecuted religious minorities could practice their faith unmolested. And we see this in the handout I sent out to my regular viewers from Daniel Pastorius, a colonial promoter from Germany in 1700, who wrote in his description of Pennsylvania, "No one sect may raise itself above the others. Each shall enjoy freedom of conscience." A very radical idea in colonial America. Now, the king, King Charles, no doubt hoped to get some of these troublesome dissidents out of England, which probably influenced his decision to grant land to William Penn in the first place. Now, Penn's Quaker ideals were reflected in the way he administered the colony. He signed treaties with the local Lenape Indians. One of those signings is shown here. Paid for peaceful access to their land. And this early painting by Benjamin West was actually commissioned by William Penn's son, Thomas. But by the time this painting was created in 1771, the Penn family had long given up any pretense of fair dealing with the Indians. Penn's political views were also progressive for their time. In 1701, he issued a Charter of Privileges, which enshrined religious tolerance in Pennsylvania. It banned the use of tax money to support any church, guaranteed freedom of worship for everyone, although Jews and atheists were barred from public office. It's interesting to note that other than Maryland, who was explicitly founded as a haven for Catholics, Pennsylvania was the only colony where Catholics could worship openly. Penn's charter also gave Pennsylvania's elected assembly the right to pass laws, making the assembly a partner with the proprietor, i.e. Penn, and the crown in England in running the colony. The charter was seen as such a great advance in representative government that on its 50th anniversary in 1751, the Pennsylvania Assembly commissioned a bell to be cast, here it is, with the biblical inscription on it, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land." 25 years later, the bell became a much wider symbol of liberty in the American Revolution. The bell hung in the steeple of the State House in Philadelphia, the building now known as Independence Hall, and was probably, we're not sure, but it was probably among the many bells that rang out in the city to announce the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. One group in Pennsylvania, of course, denied the blessings of liberty. Black slaves toiling away as farmhands, mill workers, teamsters, domestic help. Pennsylvania's slave population was much lower than the colonies in the South. There were no large plantations here that required a huge workforce, and Pennsylvania also had other sources of labor available, principally white indentured servants, who made up perhaps 1/3 of all the early immigrants to the state. In return for their passage to America, they would be bound to work for their masters for anywhere from 3 to 7 years. Afterward, of course, they were free to pursue their economic dreams in Pennsylvania, unlike the Caribbean and African blacks imported through Philadelphia. And here you have an advertisement from a Philadelphia newspaper announcing a parcel of fine young Negro slaves, boys and girls, imported, ready to be sold, on credit, if necessary. The first abolitionist protest in American history took place in Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia, in Germantown. In 1688, 4 Quakers petitioned the yearly meeting of the Society of Friends to end slavery in Pennsylvania. But their request was ignored, and despite professions of spiritual equality, Quakers were not above owning slaves. In 1780, Pennsylvania was the first state to pass a law to begin abolishing slavery. Those slaves under the age of 28 were to gain their freedom at age 28. Older slaves remained slaves. And as of 1840, there were still 40 slaves in Pennsylvania. By the first census of 1790, however, out of Pennsylvania's 430,000 inhabitants, less than 1%, about 3,700, were still enslaved. Almost twice as many were free, about 6,500 free blacks in Pennsylvania in 1790. Like this itinerant gentleman shown here, a free black in Philadelphia. Obvious, though, his social and economic status is not on a par with his established Quaker neighbors there, and you wonder what sort of conversation is going on between them. Besides Quakers, other religious groups found a welcoming home in Pennsylvania. The Moravian Church had its origins in the 15th century in present-day Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic. In 1740, Moravian missionaries came to Pennsylvania, and on Christmas Eve, 1741, they established a community named, appropriately, Bethlehem. That's what's shown here, and they'd already established a community known as Nazareth. This illustration from 1757 shows the orderly, prosperous life the Moravians made for themselves in their new land. A more radical religious community took shape in Ephrata. The Ephrata cloister was founded in 1732 by a German-born preacher and mystic by the name of Conrad Beissel. The community ran like a monastery, with men and women living in separate dormitories, sworn to celibacy. They slept on wooden benches, had one small vegetarian meal per day. They spent most of their time praying or working on communal chores or manufacturing paper and publishing religious books. An example on the left, a hymnal, shows the nun-like habits, white habits worn by the women who lived in this community. The cloister declined after Beissel's death in 1768, but the last person who had lived there as a resident did not pass away until 2008. So they continued to have a mark even after the cloister itself became a tourist site, if you will, in Pennsylvania. One important religious minority in Pennsylvania, still alive and well, of course, that's the Amish. The Amish church grew out of a split among Anabaptists in Switzerland and Alsace, eastern France, western Germany, at the end of the 17th century. The sect is named after its founder, Jacob Amann. Those who stuck with his rival, Menno Simons, became known as Mennonites. The Amish originally settled in Lancaster County, then subsequently spread north and west in search of good farmland for their growing families. The most strict practitioners of the faith are known as Old Order Amish. They believe in the redemptive power of simplicity and humility. They stand out, of course, on the roads of Lancaster County and elsewhere for their horse-drawn buggies, their dark blue or black clothing. They speak a dialect of German at home, where they avoid all the conveniences of modern life, like telephones and power line electricity. They typically operate their own one-room schools. This photograph is from 1923. Their children are educated through the 8th grade. Now, Pennsylvania, with a population of 80,000 Amish, has the largest number of any state in the U.S. And they offer an amazing testament to the power of religious faith and tradition in the modern world. European immigration to Pennsylvania took off in the 1700s. The reasons not so much political or even religious as economic. Pennsylvania was known at the time as the best poor man's country in the world. Again, you see in that document from Pastorius, he talks about the black fertile soil, fresh wholesome springs of water, the air clear and pleasant. He says, writing in 1700, "It is truly a matter for amazement how quickly, by the blessings of God, this province advances." From the very beginning, Pennsylvania farms stood out for their productivity. During the colonial era, Pennsylvania was the breadbasket of the British Empire. Agriculture, of course, is still important to state economic activity. You can tell that from this aerial view of Lancaster County. But as production of wheat and other staple grains moved to the Midwest and the Great Plains in the 19th century, Pennsylvania farmers shifted to dairy production, poultry, specialized fruits and vegetables. Naturally, many settlers came to Pennsylvania from England or Northern Ireland. The latter were known as the Scots-Irish because they had first fled from Scotland to Ireland to escape religious persecution. One famous son of an English immigrant was Daniel Boone. Who knew that he was a Pennsylvanian? Famous explorer, frontiersman. He was born in 1734 near Reading in Berks County. However, like many restless and ambitious Pennsylvanians, even today, he headed south to North Carolina and then west. The painting shows him entering Kentucky, where he founded one of the first settlements west of the Appalachians. Wherever Daniel Boone went, he certainly carried with him a Kentucky long rifle, or as it was originally known, a Pennsylvania rifle. The Pennsylvania rifle was first produced in Lancaster County. Accurate to 300 yards, remained in widespread use all the way through the end of the 19th century. And this particular rifle shown here is on display at the Walters Museum in Baltimore. The gunsmiths who fashioned the first Pennsylvania rifles were, of course, German immigrants from the Rhineland. They made Pennsylvania German culture a characteristic feature of the state, or it's sometimes referred to as Pennsylvania Dutch culture. That's really a misnomer. The word Dutch is a mistaken understanding of the word Deutsch, which is German in the Pennsylvania German dialect. So if you want to be on good terms with anyone of Pennsylvania German descent, like me on my mom's side, refer to us as Pennsylvania German, not Pennsylvania Dutch. In fact, Pennsylvania was the only colony where English settlers were a minority because of this huge influx of Germans. The German heritage in Pennsylvania can still be seen, of course, in these beautifully carved case clocks, sometimes called grandfather clocks. That's an actual 18th century clock made of cherry, available today at a high-end auction house. I pulled that off the internet. These colorful barns, of course, dot the landscape, and they have hex signs. Hex signs are not intended to ward off witches. It's just a kind of innocent folk art that became commercialized in the middle of the 20th century. Today you can buy all sorts of knickknacks with hex signs, with stars, flowers, hearts, and these stylized birds called distelfinks. So now you know what a distelfink is, in case you encounter it in your wanderings through the shops of Lancaster County. Pennsylvania Germans are also noted for their contributions to American cuisine, if I can use that term loosely. Pennsylvania Germans brought the pretzel to Pennsylvania. The state still produces 80% of the pretzels in America. And the Sturgis Pretzel Company in Lidditz, founded in 1861, the oldest commercial pretzel maker in the country. On the right is, of course, shoe fly pie, a concoction of molasses, brown sugar, and flour, sometimes eaten for breakfast in the old days before heading out into the fields for a hard day's work. A more traditional breakfast fare, shown at the top there, fried scrapple. My mom used to call this punhaus, a mixture of cornmeal mush with minced pork scraps. Definitely an acquired taste. Pennsylvania German culture is on display very near here at the Landis Valley Village and Farm Museum in Lancaster. I know you've been there on tours from Willow Valley. 100-acre site operated by the State Historical and Museum Commission. Has costume guides bringing history to life with demonstrations of traditional cooking and crafts, from leatherworking to blacksmithing. The site includes a barn, a tavern, a firehouse, a stable, and of course a country store to relieve you of some of your disposable income. Not all of Pennsylvania's economic life centered on the farms and fields of the state. A lot of wealth was to be found underground. During the colonial era, Pennsylvania's output of iron for tools, nails, weapons was second only to the British Isles themselves. You get a sense of this at the Cornwall Iron Furnace in Lebanon County. Established in 1742, it was one of about 80 blast furnaces, forges, and other ironworks operating in Pennsylvania in the 18th century. It ran until 1883. It's since been restored and now open to the public, has the only intact charcoal burning iron smelter in the Western Hemisphere. Fascinating site. Well, in the mid-18th century, conflict is looming England was not the only European country settling North America. The French had sizable claims on the continent, especially in the interior. And the French territory here is shown in yellow, British territory in pink, and here's the area of contention just along and west of the Appalachian Mountains, disputed territory. So at the western frontier of Pennsylvania, this great power rivalry came to a head in the French and Indian War. Trouble began in 1754 when the French established Fort Duquesne, present-day Pittsburgh, to protect their own settlers in the area and secure the forks of the Ohio River. That, again, is where the Allegheny and Monongahela combine to form the Ohio River, a vital route through French territory all the way down the Mississippi River down to New Orleans. Britain was determined to challenge the French on this frontier, but there were no troops available in Pennsylvania itself due to the pacifist influence of the Quakers. Instead, the British Crown, tapped the Virginia militia to augment a small body of British regulars, total of about 400 soldiers, leading a force out west, led by a 22-year-old colonel in the Virginia militia named George Washington. In May of 1754, Washington attacked a small French-Canadian force, kills the commander, then builds this makeshift fort. Here it is reconstructed, Fort Necessity, to hold his position. The French counterattack with a much larger force. Washington and his troops are defeated. Washington surrenders, and the French very gallantly allow him to return home to Virginia. When news of the battle reaches England, the Crown decides to send a larger expedition under General Braddock in 1755 to dislodge the French on this western frontier, but that ends in a disaster. French and their Indian allies ambush the British. Braddock is killed. George Washington, who is serving as Braddock's aide, has 2 horses shot out from under him. Tension grows, the fighting escalates, and in 1756, France and Britain declare war. All the European powers are gradually dragged into one side or the other. This global conflict is known internationally as the 7 Years' War. In 1758, George Washington, again, he's back in action. He's now leading a Virginia regiment in the Forbes expedition, another military expedition by the British. He finds Fort Duquesne abandoned, and near the ruins of Fort Duquesne, the British build Fort Pitt. And here you can see an artist's rendering of Fort Pitt on the forks of the Monongahela and the Allegheny. And you'll recognize this, of course, as the Point in present-day Pittsburgh. Very strategic location. Now this area is known as Point State Park. And there you'll find a museum and the only building surviving from the war, a blockhouse built in 1764, the oldest building in western Pennsylvania. Well, with the end of the 7 Years' War, in 1763, Britain acquires all of North America east of the Mississippi. And although white settlement is forbidden west of the Appalachians, intended to be a reserve for the Indians, that's promptly ignored. And settlers continue to flood the western frontier. Tensions with the natives flare throughout the mid-1700s. In 1755, Shawnee raiders, accompanied by several Frenchmen, capture a teenage girl named Mary Jemison. She's shown there, captured from her family's farm in Adams County. And this statue is on the spot. It's actually in a parking lot in Adams County. Later, Mary married a warrior who took her to upstate New York, near Buffalo. There she acquired land along the Genesee River, raised 6 kids, gained local fame as the white woman of the Genesee. And late in life, she told her story to a minister who published her narrative, very exciting reading in the 19th century, one of those numerous captivity narratives that were so popular at that time. Now, violence on the frontier was not limited to Indians. In 1763, a group of Scots-Irish vigilantes known as the Paxton Boys claimed that Susquehanna Indians were raiding homes. But the Indians had actually been living for decades on land that had been ceded to them by William Penn. They had good relations with their neighbors. Many had converted to Christianity. But without provocation, the Paxton Boys attacked a small Susquehanna Indian settlement in Lancaster County, murdered 6 of them. The governor, John Penn, placed 16 surviving Indians under his protective custody. But 14 of them, including children, were captured, killed, and scalped, as you can see in this contemporary engraving. The perpetrators were never identified, probably due to local sympathy for the vigilantes. And the following year, they marched en masse to meet with colonial leaders in Philadelphia to protest the failure of the Quaker-dominated government to protect them. But Pennsylvania was not totally defenseless. And since I am a retired National Guard officer, I will share my enthusiasm with you. In 1747, volunteers in Philadelphia had banded together to protect the approaches to the city from French and Dutch privateers coming up Delaware Bay. These volunteers became known as the Associators, the forerunners of the Pennsylvania militia, and its modern-day descendant, the citizen soldiers of the Pennsylvania National Guard. The traditions of the Associators are still preserved in Philadelphia's 111th Infantry, which is an active regiment within the National Guard's 28th Infantry Division. I'll talk more about the 28th Division in the last session when we get to World Wars I and II. But here's the unit crest of the 111th Infantry in Philadelphia, and it shows the image of the man who founded the Associators, none other than Ben Franklin. Here's old Ben, probably the most influential citizen Pennsylvania ever produced. The famous portrait on the left was painted in 1778 at the height of his fame. You can tell he's obviously a man of substance. He had an amazing life before he came to Pennsylvania. He was born in Boston in 1706, ran away at the age of 17 to find a new life in Philadelphia, went into the printing trade. But he was more than a humble craftsman. He published newspapers, almanacs. Later, he invented the Franklin stove, the lightning rod, bifocal glasses, and the glass harmonica, shown here. This is a musical instrument. Actually, Mozart composed music for it. It involves the same principle as when you wet your fingers, rub them across the rim of a glass. These spinning glass discs, they're in a water bath down here, and you play the glasses of different sizes with your fingers, thereby producing a kind of music. Anyway, quite a talented individual. And he not only invented things, he founded some very important civic organizations. Philadelphia's first library, its first fire department, and its first hospital, the Pennsylvania Hospital, founded in 1751. Franklin also gained fame on the international stage. While serving as a colonial agent in London before the Revolutionary War, which is where this portrait was painted, he hobnobbed with the greatest scientists and intellectuals in Britain. Notice he's wearing a gold-braided suit, appropriate for the London elite. He cultivated a different image in 1776. America was now in revolt. He was serving as ambassador to France and dressed as a simple man of the people. His fur hat may have been just intended to hide a scalp condition. We don't know, but the French were already in a revolutionary mood themselves. They went wild over this backwoods genius from North America. It is said while he was in Paris that the ladies enjoyed his company as well, and you can certainly research that topic on your own. Well, as America was moving towards independence from Britain, Pennsylvania played a key role. Philadelphia especially became known as the birthplace of the nation. Here's a late 18th century painting of Philadelphia. Population of about 30,000. It was the largest city in British North America and the second largest city in the entire British Empire, second only to London. And as a center for revolutionary activity, Philadelphia had an important advantage over the rival cities of New York and Boston. Pennsylvania's tradition of religious and political tolerance made it the one place where delegates from a great diversity of regions in the colonies would feel comfortable getting together, or at least feel accepted by their peers. When the British Parliament imposed a blockade on Boston and passed punitive laws after the Boston Tea Party, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1774 to discuss a unified colonial response. There was a slight hitch, however. The conservative elite of Philadelphia, lawyers, Quaker merchants, wealthy estate owners, they were initially lukewarm to the idea of colonial resistance. In fact, the Pennsylvania Assembly refused to allow the Congress to meet in the State House, shown here. So the Congress got together in a symbolic working class venue, Carpenter's Hall, here on the right. This building is still owned by the Carpenters Company, the oldest craft guild in America, now made up of 200 prominent architects, contractors, and structural engineers. One site in Philadelphia that you might want to add to your list. I also want to make a comment about this engraving of the State House over here. As I said, this became Independence Hall, and it doesn't look like the Independence Hall that you're accustomed to seeing, because now you approach Independence Hall from what was the back in this area, that grassy area facing Independence Hall. This is actually the front of Independence Hall, not often seen in present-day imagery. Well, the first Congress voted to impose an embargo on British trade and petition the king for redress of grievances, but it had no effect. And so after the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775, the shot heard round the world, a second Congress met, this time in the State House, to plan the military defense of the colonies and eventually declare total independence from Britain. This famous painting is in the Capitol Rotunda, shows not the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but a five-man commission here is presenting a draft to the Congress in late June of 1776. And sure enough, there in the back is our Pennsylvania hero, Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was also in charge at this time of writing a new constitution for Pennsylvania. The old proprietary government under which the Penns ruled was in effect dissolved by the Second Continental Congress for not supporting independence with sufficient enthusiasm. And so Pennsylvania's constitution, originating in 1776, has been described as the most democratic in America. It extended the vote to all free men over 21, including free blacks, as long as they paid taxes. It also contained a Declaration of Rights, which echoes America's founding documents. For example, the Pennsylvania Constitution states that all power is derived from the people. All public officials are accountable to the people. And among other things, it provides for freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, and the right of every member of society to be protected in the enjoyment of life, liberty, and property. By the way, the Constitution also made Pennsylvania officially a commonwealth, an old English term for a political community bounded by the common good of all. Pennsylvania is one of 4 commonwealths in the U.S. The others, be a good question for Jeopardy. The others are Virginia, Massachusetts, and Kentucky. Well, before Pennsylvanians could fully enjoy their life, liberty, and property, they had a war to fight. And next time you're in Philadelphia, you can get a great overview of the Revolution at the Museum of the American Revolution, opened just in 2017. It's in the heart of the historic district, a couple of blocks from Independence Hall, Liberty Bell, Carpenter's Hall, all the other noteworthy sites in colonial Philadelphia. The museum displays several thousand objects, including George Washington's campaign tent, a kind of holy relic of the Revolution. Also features a replica of Boston's famous Liberty Tree, a recreation of an Indian War Council, and the large model of a deck of an 18th century privateer ship. Great site to visit, fun for the kids as well as the history-minded adults. The first year of the war was dire for the American cause. Boston was already suffering under British occupation. Washington and his Continental Army were driven out of New York in the fall of 1776. Morale was low, popular support was wavering. On the night of December 25th, 26th, 1776, one of the most dramatic incidents of the war transpired. From his winter camp in Pennsylvania, George Washington crossed the ice-covered Delaware River, surprised and overwhelmed a garrison of Hessian mercenaries at Trenton. And you know the famous painting, of course, George Washington was not foolish enough to stand up in an open boat, but that's how he's portrayed there, kind of a legendary image of the great Washington. 22 enemy were killed in Trenton, 900 captured, versus only 300 American killed in action. This was a decisive victory, gave the flagging rebellion a much needed boost going into 1777. 1777 then brought a surprise American victory at Saratoga in upstate New York, and the British then turned their attention to the rebel capital at Philadelphia, which they captured in September of 1777. A week later, at Germantown, George Washington attacked the main British camp, but his efforts were hampered by fog. His troops spent too much time fighting a small British contingent in this stone mansion here. After the British rally, Washington was lucky to escape this battle with most of his forces intact. The British occupation of Philadelphia forced Congress to evacuate the city to first Lancaster, and then they ended up in York for about 9 months. The Congress set up operations in the old courthouse, shown here. That building was torn down in 1844, but there's a replica in York built for the bicentennial. It's a somewhat smaller version. It's minus the large cupola. And it's part of the colonial complex, a couple of historic buildings in downtown York, well worth a visit. Well, the Congress met in York for 9 months. It was here that Congress adopted the first form of national government, the Articles of Confederation. And in that document, for the first time, the former colonies are referred to as the United States of America. So this is why residents of York, if nowhere else, will claim that York was the first capital of, quote, the United States of America. Well, there was no love lost between the sophisticated delegates originally from Philadelphia and other urban centers and great estates in the South. Most of them were descended from upper-class English background. And when they got to the far side of the Susquehanna River in York, they encountered these German-speaking bumpkins. John Adams of Boston called the people of York a breed of mongrels benumbed with a general torpor. Benjamin Rush, noted physician from Philadelphia, referred to York as, quote, the damnedest hole in the world. And they might take offense at that. Well, after Congress fled Philadelphia. Washington was forced to spend the winter of 1777-78 in rough quarters 20 miles west of the city at Valley Forge. His army numbered about 12,000, including some family members and some native allies. During 6 months in camp, over 1,000 men died from disease, exacerbated by exposure and malnutrition. The one positive note to come out of Valley Forge was the arrival of a Prussian drill master, Baron Friedrich von Steuben, who imparted valuable training and discipline to Washington's ragtag force. The Americans also had a secret weapon under their sleeve, the legendary Molly Pitcher. Now, there wasn't anybody really named Molly Pitcher. The name may just be an amalgam of various camp followers, women who carried water and ammunition on the Revolutionary battlefields. But the woman who appears in legend as Molly Pitcher, commonly believed to be a native of New Jersey, named Mary Hayes. She married a sergeant in the Pennsylvania State Artillery, joined him at Valley Forge, and then saw action with him at the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey in 1778. As the story goes, when her husband William fell wounded, she took his place, loading and firing a cannon, earning the personal thanks of George Washington afterward. After the war, she and her husband moved to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, west of Harrisburg, and she's honored today with a statue in Carlisle in a cemetery suitably named the Molly Pitcher Cemetery. Here is her bronze statue, and you'll notice the lace collar, not part of the original sculpture, but it showed up on this statue at the time of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death. So there's a tribute from a female heroine of one era to a female heroine of another. In 1778, the focus of the Revolutionary War began shifting south, where the British had high hopes for getting some support among loyalists in the South. The last major clash in Pennsylvania occurred in July of 1778. It's known as the Wyoming Massacre. It was part of a British guerrilla campaign against settlers on the northern frontier of the colonies. In this action, 100 loyalists, backed up by 450 Iroquois allies, attacked Forty Fort and 2 other settlements near Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The inexperienced militia defenders were overwhelmed. Over 300 people, including family members, were killed, and afterwards there were reports of torture, other atrocities committed by the Indians against the victims. These reports circulated throughout the colonies. And a year later, American troops, in retaliation, destroyed Iroquois villages all the way up into New York State. The hapless settlers at Forty Fort were actually interlopers from Connecticut. They were Yankees squatting on land that the Iroquois had already sold to the Penns. And this area, especially here in the circle, was embroiled in 30 years of on and off fighting, known as the Yankee Pennamite Wars. Pennamite, of course, derived from William Penn. And the map shows that Connecticut, over here, was claiming land all the way west to the Mississippi. At one point, Congress had to intervene under the Articles of Confederation to try to resolve the dispute. It finally petered out when the Yankees agreed to give up their claims to what is now Pennsylvania and become loyal Pennsylvanians. Well, it's clear from the Yankee Pennamite Wars and other incidents that the Articles of Confederation were an inadequate basis for an effective federal government. So in 1787, 55 delegates convened again in the Pennsylvania State House, in the same room where they had deliberated over the Declaration of Independence, and created a new constitution for the Republic. The oldest delegate, 1787, was none other than Ben Franklin. Now seated, after all, he was 81 years old. And he emerges here in our story as we conclude the colonial era in Pennsylvania. And next week, we'll move on to the tail end of the 18th century, and especially the 19th century, a period when the factories, the mines, the mills, the railroads of Pennsylvania made it the powerhouse of the nation. So our story will pick up the thread at that time. We'll be talking, of course, about the Civil War. We'll be talking about the launch of the commercial oil industry, the logging boom in Pennsylvania, all of the turmoil associated with the mining and steel working industries in Pennsylvania, and touch on a few more fun topics as well, including the history of the oldest brewery in Pennsylvania. You already may know what it is. In fact, it's on your handout, but I'll pretend you're surprised next week when I talk about Yuengling Brewery in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. All right, that concludes this program, and I'm going to look now for any questions from the audience.
Questions today?
Okay, no questions. Great. Let me also mention to you, I just have a minute here, my main source for this program, fabulous book entitled, What Else? Pennsylvania, A History of the Commonwealth, published by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission about 20 years ago. I got familiar with it during a course in Pennsylvania history I was taking at Shippensburg. And although it is a textbook and can be a bit dense at times, if you want a single comprehensive history of Pennsylvania that you can pick up and dip into and return to later on, highly recommended to you. I'll put that information in my email to my regular viewers tomorrow. And also I'm going to include two optional readings, certainly for next week's program on some significant events in the latter part of the 19th century, one being the Johnstown flood, the other being the rise of the great steel magnates such as Andrew Carnegie. So look for that tomorrow, and I hope to see you all next week as we explore the 19th century in Pennsylvania history, when Pennsylvania became the powerhouse of the nation. I'll see you then.